BMS controls and protects the battery cells. It is super important. It makes sure that everything is running as it should and how it should. And if any parameters start to get a little wonky, it shuts it down right away and avoids a big catastrophic fire. So setting up the BMS is super important, which is why it merits its own episode, which is exactly what you're going to get here. In this episode, we're going to show you guys how to connect a BMS, how to program the BMS, and what the different parameters of the BMS do and mean, and why you need to have all these things set. Once we're done with this, then we're going to start the top balancing. And top balancing is its own topic as well. So at the end of this video, you're going to see a link to take you to the top balancing part. And that'll show you how to get the battery top balanced and fully set. At the end of the top balancing video, there's going to be a link that'll take you back to the video that you came here from, which is building this battery in the first place. So by watching all of these other videos that go with that video, you will not only understand how to build a battery, but how to build a battery safely. To make it safe, we're going to now hook up the BMS, which is the thing that balances, monitors, and most importantly, shuts this thing down if anything gets near a direction that is heading towards something bad. What the BMS does is it monitors the battery's temperature, because if they get too hot, they explode. It monitors the voltage, because if each cell gets overcharged or undercharged, it explodes. Pretty much if anything bad happens, it explodes. That's just the standard thing with lithium batteries. So all these different parameters are all there to keep this thing safe. That way it doesn't explode on you. Okay, when you're getting BMSs, you have to get the one for the voltage of battery that you're building. So in our case, we're building a 12-volt battery, so we want the one that's 4S. If we're building a 24-volt battery, we want 8S because it's 8 cells in series. And for our boat motor, we use a 48-volt battery, and they are 16S because it's 16 cells in series. Now, when you're getting the BMS, you want to buy it from Overkill Solar. They're the place to buy a BMS. Like these cells I bought at Doken Power, the BMS I bought at Overkill Solar. In the past, I bought the exact same type of BMS, not from Overkill Solar. And then I had to turn around and buy it again from Overkill Solar. So it's like $5 or $10 more than you can get them in other places, but they come with a lifetime warranty. They work, and everything is good on them. If you get them from the other places, like I said, you'll run them for a little bit, and then you're going to get the one from Overkill Solar. Now, this comes with Bluetooth, and later I'll show you guys how to set up the Bluetooth app and get all your parameters put in there. But this is a very, very convenient wiring diagram for how you set up a BMS. It might seem a little complicated, but it is very simple. The BMS comes with these two guys. Now, if you're doing a 12-volt battery, you only have 5 wires to deal with. If you're doing a 48-volt battery like we did, then you're going to have 17 wires to deal with. Now, this wire is to an external switch that I don't mess with, so that guy is trash. Now we're going to go to the actual BMS cable. Now on the BMS cabling, you have a little plug, then you have black, red, and a bunch of white cables. Now what this is, the black one is the most negative, then the next positive, then the next, whoops, black is most negative, then the next positive, then the next positive, then the next positive, and then it should be your last positive. Now, this is an important part. When you're hooking this up, if you do it wrong, and you have this guy plugged into the BMS, you will fry your BMS, and it's dead. Avoid that issue by not having this plugged in while you're hooking it up. Once you have it all hooked up and everything, you then take these little leads, you take these little plug points here, and you just put the negative in the most negative one, and then the next one should tell you 3.3, and then 6.6, 9.9, 13.6, like that. It should go adding up. If as you're going, they're not in order of 3, 6, 9, 12, and it goes, say, 6, 3, 9, 12, like whatever, that means you have it wired up wrong, and it'll fry your BMS. So just fix the wires, test it again. When you have it right, then hook it up to the BMS. So if you see, remember when I was talking about the cells, how I said most positive and most negative, and how each one is positive or negative along the way? So the black is the most negative wire. the red, is the most positive wire. All right, the first step in hooking up your BMS is get all your terminals put on. Just get them all on at once. So we're going to just take all these off, and then we're going to put on our little heat shrink, do our heat shrinking, get that set. This is the most positive. This is the most negative. So it goes positive, negative, positive, negative, positive, negative, positive, negative, and then out. So when you're hooking up the BMS, you come to the plug, and this is the most negative. So we're going to just pull that cable out, which is obviously the black one. And we're going to hook it up to the most negative. You can go to this one or to this one. So there's the most negative. All right, now we come back to the plug. You have the most negative. The next one, which is this white one, right here, separate from the other two, is the next positive. So this is the most negative. The very next positive is right here. So this guy is the one you want to hook to. So since this one already has two connections on it, I'm going to go to this one down here, which only has one. Now, in theory, you could attach this positive one to here, here, or here. All of these are the next positive. The reason I go to this one is just to make things visually make more sense. That way I have the black one to the negative, and then the white ones and the last red one all to positives. Now, if you also notice, I'm routing all of these cables up. And the reason is that when we put the box together, up is important because this is going to be the bottom of the battery and this is going to be the top, and I want all the cables coming up and around. I don't want them going under the battery and getting crushed. We have these two. Now the next white one, which is this one, is the next positive. Negative, positive, next positive, right here. So we have the negative, the next positive, the next positive. Now we have the next positive, which goes here. The last one is this red one, which is the most positive cable. And like I said, you could go to the top one, you could go to the bottom one. All right, now all of these wires then are going to come along, and we're just going to set them up and out of the way. This isn't plugged into the BMS yet, so therefore if anything's wrong, it's just a matter of reorienting where the cables go and everything would be fine. So we're going to take the negative and we're going to pop it into the most negative, so the black with the black, and then we're going to go to the first white one with 3.3. And go to the next white one with 6.6. It's increasing. And we have 9.9. And we have 13.2. Say we go and the first one's 3.3 and then the next one's 9.9 and then 6.6. You got it hooked up wrong. So here it goes incrementally increasing in magnitude. Next step is the BMS itself. So when you buy yours from Overkill Solar, it comes with this little check sheet, which just shows that everything works on the thing. So it checked, the temperature cutoffs, everything. Because if the battery gets too hot, too cold, overcharged, undercharged, charged too quickly, discharged too quickly, some combination thereof, it can explode. And the BMS's job is to make sure that it doesn't explode by shutting it down at the correct time. So this just shows that everything on it worked, and its overall result was that it passed. So we're good. So this says on it, it's 120 amps, 4S, 12 volt. If you're building a 24 volt battery, you'd get the 8S 24 volt. If you're building a 48 volt battery, you'd get the 16S 48 volt, and so on and so on. So it says on it, it's the BMS for 4 lithium iron phosphate cells. Even though these are 8 cells, they're still set up as groups of 2, so it's technically just 4 cells. And that's it. This is the thing you want to get. Connecting the BMS is really, really simple. There's one side that says B negative. That's the battery side. So the negative battery cable goes to this side. C negative, I always think of as cable negative because the negative cable, that's just a stupid mnemonic. The important part is into the BMS from the negative side of the battery, out of the BMS to the negative terminal that stuff connects to. So this is just an interrupter switch. If anything goes wrong with the battery, according to all of those little wires we just hooked up, and the temperature sensor, and a bunch of other stuff, it turns it off. It disconnects the battery and then it shuts it down. And then you're good. There's no fire, no problems at all. So when you're hooking it up, just remember, battery on B negative, cables on C negative. And then all your other cables hook up down here with the plug. And we're going to attach the temperature probe. So the temperature probe, you want to attach it right to the side of a cell. You don't want it getting the temperature of inside the box or anything else. You want the cell itself. If the cell gets hot, it shuts down the whole thing. Any cell is fine because they should all be about the same temperature. And also there's only one temperature probe, so you kind of have to pick one. So I always just go with the one that's closest or easiest, but just get it directly onto the cell. Some people like putting them on the face, some on the sides. It's all the same as long as it's directly to the cell and not near the cell or floating or something like that. The next one we're going to do is the Bluetooth dongle. For that we're just going to coil up in here. Just going to set that right there. Nice and out of the way. Okay, there it's attached. It's not touching the bottom. That way when we put it in, it's not getting jammed weirdly or anything like that. And we're good there. So temperature sensors on, Bluetooth dongles set down here. This is going to get pinched down by the negative battery cables. I have it set upside down like this. That way the battery negative is a close run to the actual battery negative. And last but not least, we're going to now plug in all of this. That's set there, and we are almost done with this. So I'm just going to bring these cables along here. We're going to do some tightening up, and then we'll move on to the next step of hooking up the battery cables, which are some big suckers. Okay, when it comes to battery cables, you're going to need 2 of each. So we have a positive, and it's going to go from the most positive, and it's going to wrap around the side and go to the back, because that's where the positive terminal for the battery is going to be. And for the negatives, we need 2 sets. So one that goes from the negative to the BMS, and then another that goes from the BMS and is going to wrap around the back and come around to the front side, because that's where the negative terminal is going to be on the battery box. So now we just put this lug on and then crush it in a hydraulic press. Okay, so if you notice, when I made these, one is slightly longer than the other. And the reason for that is this one has a shorter run to this pole, but this one has to go down and then back up. So it's a longer run. So now I'm just going to tighten all the screws. Just make sure that I didn't leave one not tightened yet, because now we are done with taking things on and off. Okay, the next step is to hook things up to the BMS itself. So the BMS is here. This is the B minus. So this is the side that goes to the battery. And for this, we need a 10mm socket. So this side is now hooked up BMS to the battery. The next side is going to be the C minus, which I call cable side. Okay, now you want these on really tight, because once we close up the box, we never want to have to open it again. Now when you go to buy the BMS, it comes with a couple different options. One is the BMS like this with screw studs, so that way you can bolt on your own cables. I prefer that one. The other option is nothing. It's just this, and then you solder on your own wires. Not my favorite. Then they also have one where that comes with its own wires. That one's okay. I just prefer the bolt-on version because you can just swap it out. It's bolt-on, so you can easily unbolt it. It doesn't take any fancy tools. How to set up the app on your phone. That way you can A, monitor everything, and B, set it up with the proper parameters. So these are the parameters that I like. Okay, so this is the app for the battery. Now in the bottom left corner, you want to hit configure, and the first part where it says basic settings, BMS alias name, that is where you name your battery. On Wisdom, we have each battery named after a different type of electric Pokemon. You can name it whatever you want. Being how this is not my battery, I'm building this for someone else, I named them appropriately Battery 1 and Battery 2. This guy's Battery 2. So I set the BMS alias name and the BMS Bluetooth name to be the same. That way, when you go to the home screen, you know which one you're looking at. So example, going back to the home screen, you have Battery 1 and Battery 2. So click on Battery 2, click on Configure. Okay, now we go to the one with the screwdriver and the wrench. It's the BMS settings. Now it pulls up absolutely nothing. Hit BMS read, and it's going to just load everything that's there. Let it finish. If you hit any button while it's still counting down, you're screwed. It'll never finish opening and you can't save anything. It's a mess. So don't do that. So now we have all the values written here. Now this is reading off the BMS. This is what's already pre-programmed in there. Okay, so we're just going to look through the settings that I have on the BMS. So in this situation, they're 100 amp hour cells, so we have 200 amp hours total. Now, the total battery capacity, that is in milliamp hours, so that means add 1,000. So that means you have 200 amp hours, add 3 more zeros behind it. Now the total cycle capacity, I have it set conservatively. We have 180,000 milliamp hours available. Cell full voltage, I have it cut off. I have it consider the cells full at 3.550 and the minimum voltage at 2.900. All right. These percentage of capacity, that it pulls from the BMS, so I don't mess with those. All right, balance configuration. Have balancer enabled and don't have it only when charging. Have it just all the time, because if the batteries are super full, they'll turn off the charging ability and then they won't balance. So if you're on your boat and you leave your boat and the solar panels are there charging and it's just going to get super full charge over like the next week or so, it's not going to balance because as soon as the cells are full, it's going to turn off the BMS or the BMS is going to turn off the battery and it'll stop charging and it won't balance because it's not charging. So have balance only when charging, make sure that is off. The delta variance, I have it at 0.1 or at 15 millivolts. So that means if they're off by more than 0.15, sorry, if they're off by more than 0.015, it starts balancing. And it won't start balancing until 3.5 volts. The reason is lithium batteries are they'll hang out forever in the like 3.2, 3.3, 3.4 range. They can be very different in the amount of charge that each battery has or each cell has, but they'll be all about the same voltage. So if you start balancing at that point, you're just going to mess things up. Once you exceed 3.5 volts, then any difference in charge is very dramatic, because when one's at like 98% charge, it'll be at, I'm just making up a number here, 3.5. And at 99% charge, it'll be at 3.62. And that's a huge jump. So having it start the balancing when all the cells are at 3.5 means that it won't start prematurely and it won't mess things up, because you want to get them all about the same, but you only want to do that at the top end. So if the battery is like in use and one cell's got a little more power than the other, don't start the balancing, because when they charge back up, they're probably going to go back to where they were and everything will be fine and it'll be balanced. So if you start balancing it in the middle, everything's out of whack. So just make sure balance enabled, off for the only charging, start at 3.5, And the variance, I have it at 0.15 or 15 millivolts. Okay, the switch part, we threw out that wire, so don't worry about it. All right, now here's the protections. Now this is to keep stuff super safe. Cell over voltage 3.65, so 3,650 millivolts. If any cell hits that voltage, it shuts the battery down, and it won't turn the battery back on until the cells come down on their own to 3.55. Now the cell under voltage, it cuts off the battery. If the battery gets to 2.5 volts, it turns it off, and it won't turn the battery back on until 3 volts per cell. But it does charge when the battery is turned off. So that means that if your solar panels are there, it'll turn off the battery so it won't keep discharging, won't damage itself or burst into flames, but it will charge back up. So that's really important to have there. Now, in this case, it's a 12-volt battery, so battery over voltage. So if the battery exceeds 14.6 volts, turns off. And it won't turn back on until the voltage drops on its own down to 14.4 volts. So it's pretty much a timeout for the battery. It's like, hey, you're a little too heated, calm down. When you calm down, then we'll talk again. And then the under voltage is set for 11 volts, and it won't turn back on until it gets to 12 volts, just for safety reasons. Now, charge-wise, if the battery is charged at more than 70 amps, turns off. And if discharge is at 100 amps, it'll turn off. Now the BMS is rated to take it all the way up to 120 amps, but that's kind of pushing it. Prismatic cells, they don't like to be charged or discharged quickly. So there's a value, they call it the C value. It's column, and it's how quickly can a battery charge or discharge. So 1C with a capital C refers to that the battery can charge or discharge at 1 times its rate in amp hours. So being how these are 100 amp batteries, 1C is 100 amps. 2C would be 200 amps. 3C is 300 amps. Now these batteries are rated to momentarily, for a very short amount of time, it's about 3 seconds or so, it can do 3C, but it's going to damage the battery in the process. So why do that? If you need 3C, get more batteries. To keep things happy, we're going to be charging at no more than 0.7 capital C and discharging at no more than 1 capital C. That's a nice safe number. It keeps everything happy. The batteries can do much more than that, but why push them? So the temperature cutoff part. Now this is important. The batteries will not charge if it is greater than 65 degrees centigrade. And they will not charge if they're colder than 1 degree centigrade. Now that's when it cuts off. It'll turn back on and let them work again if the charging temperature, if the temperature comes down to 55 degrees centigrade or up to 10 degrees centigrade. Now the reason is, you exceed 65, the cells can burst into flames. I believe 65 is like 160 some. You just don't want to go there. And then the cells can't go less than 0. Like at 0, they shouldn't be operating, which is why I have it cut off at 1 instead of at 0. Now, if it's the dead of winter, warm your boat. If your boat's warm, your batteries are warm. The discharge temperature, that one I have set so that it gives you power in a little bit more situation. It'll cut off the discharging if the temperature exceeds 75 centigrade, and it'll turn back on when they cool down to 65 centigrade. Now I can tell you, our batteries in the dinghy that sit in the sun in a black Pelican case, and then we draw 50 amps out of them to motor the dinghy everywhere. In Florida, never hit anywhere near these values. They'd see like 100, 120 degrees. That's like 30 to 40 centigrade. So they don't get that hot. So don't worry about ventilation or anything. They do just fine. Now, the discharge under voltage, the discharge minimum temperatures, I have it set at minus 10C to cut off the batteries, and don't turn them back on until they warm up to 0C. So that's there. Now, if you are drawing from the batteries, they will get warm. So if you're drawing from the batteries, I don't want it to cut off at 0 because, one, it shouldn't have gotten to 0 because you're using them. And then the second part is I don't want it to to cut off when you need them, because then you can't use them to make them hot to keep them running. So that's why the discharge temperature is set really low, because if you're drawing from them, you're going to be drawing in pretty big loads probably. And when you draw in a big load, it then warms them up. So they stay in a nice happy temperature. Now, if you're not around and they're charging, that's why it's a little more stringent on when does it charge and when does it not charge. That is how I set the BMS. So if you want to just take a little screenshot of this, that's the settings. Going to currently save this. And then this is the beauty. You can go from one to another, and you go into configure. When it thinks about it. Just getting there. I don't know why it keeps asking for a pin. I've never set a pin on these. All right. And then open configuration, 12-volt battery build, and it'll populate everything from the other battery. And then BMS write. Oh, we had an issue. All right, BMS read. Okay. And now open configuration. All right. And now write. Okay. There it wrote everything. So yellow are things that you've changed, and then they're supposed to save. So when you do the write, they should go to 0. But there we have the balancer starts at 3.5 when the variance is greater than 15. And the balancer is enabled, and it is not only enabled when charging. So it's enabled all the time, but only when it gets to 3.5 volts. And then we have the parameters for safety reasons. Now, if you're using your batteries and you run out of juice, but you really need just a little bit more power just for whatever reason, you come in here, the cell under voltage trigger, bring it down, make it lower. Now, you're playing with fire literally in those situations, so be very careful if you do that. But these are the parameters that I run that are quite safe. All right, so then we leave. Now, I like to then go back and open it again and BMS read and make sure that the stuff that I put in there got saved, because I've had it happen before where I set all these parameters, left, and then nothing got updated. And then when I was using the batteries, they weren't working right because they weren't set properly. So just come back in here, everything's good, and we're good there. Now with the charge overcurrent, it'll release in 32 seconds. 10 seconds after. So it has to hit 70 amps for 10 seconds, and then it's going to cut it off, and it's going to wait 30 seconds or 32 seconds. And that's just so that whatever's happening, like there might be like a solar flare going on out there, or just whatever. Give it some time to pass, let it calm down, and then start the batteries again. Because if you start it again, it's a lot of abuse on the BMS. Now the discharge overcurrent, I have that set to release after 2 seconds, because imagine that your motor, like if this is your propulsion and you exceed the 100 amps and it cuts off, you have no power. You're now drifting for 30 seconds. Like you don't want that. You want it really quick. So 2 seconds is a nice little warning. It's like, hey, slow down, calm yourself. Okay, here's your power again. If you have it set longer than that, you could hit stuff because you don't have a motor until it comes back on. Now, for house loads, not that big of an issue. Your lights are going to just turn off, and then they come right back on. So it's a nice warning that tells you, hey, you're using too much, turn stuff off, and take it easy. So that is how we set the BMS on this. Your BMS is now fully set up, configured, and connected to your battery. Everything is ready to roll. The next step that you need to do to fully maximize the amount of power that your battery can hold is to top balance it. And that is going to be covered in the next episode.